Hi, and welcome to the next segment of Learning with Power. And I'm your host, Scott Powers Houston. And we are continuing to blow away false narratives. And so today we're going to address actually 3 false narratives. And the first false narrative that I will address actually was, again, I was inspired by watching Pawn Stars. And Rick gives us history, of all of these, like badass queens that lived in history. And of course, he completely omits the Empress Irene. And he declares that Queen Elizabeth I was the most badass queen because she, tried so hard to make sure that she wouldn't get married and things like that. She, made certain that she stayed in power. Well, that's nothing compared to what Irene did. But again, the Western education, Irene is not regarded as being important when actually at the time that Irene lived, she most certainly was the richest and most powerful leader in the world at that time. So we'll talk more about Irene later on, but that was a big omission. Another person that he didn't mention is called Tomyris. And Tomyris lived actually in BC times, and she conquered, and she's from probably the area of Uzbekistan now, lived basically the way that the ancient Mongolians lived at that time, the Mongol nomads. And ultimately, she defeated the great Persian emperor at that time. And there's actually been a movie about her fairly recently, which I recommend seeing. And of course, it's getting a lot of controversy because the Muslim people that are watching the movie are adamant against it and say, oh, it's not true, because they don't like the idea that one of their greatest leaders was toppled by a female queen. But it's a fairly well substantiated story, although anything that happened in that part of the world in BC times does not have a whole lot of documentation. So but we think it's mostly true. And then he does go on to mention another one called Cleopatra. Now that's one that I'm going to address in more detail today. And the first thing that I would like to say about Cleopatra is that she most certainly, absolutely was not black. And so that's why I'm dealing with the Irene thing and also the Cleopatra thing at this time, is because both of these things are a little bit more contemporary issues. But Cleopatra, yeah, most certainly was not black. And they can put black people as Cleopatra in movies all they want, and try to claim that that's really how she looked all they want, and they can project and put out this false narrative and a fantasy all they want. But Cleopatra lived at a time when we do have very good historical documentation, and we can be 99.999, actually 100% certain she was not black. First of all, she was the last of the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies were a long line of leaders in Rome during the Roman Republic. Many of them were heads of state. They were basically equivalent to what would be like a prime minister or speaker of the house or something. They were the head of the Senate. And the Ptolemies were from Egypt, or excuse me, were from Greece. They were Greek. And they looked Greek. And so basically Cleopatra was Greek. And they say, oh well, Cleopatra was actually product of the Ptolemies, yes, but also a mix with the local culture, as if they're all black. And the whole narrative comes from the idea of African American, as if all of Africa was black. And actually the name, to be more accurate, should have been called Sub-Saharan African, because north of the Sahara Desert, not black. Not black at all, especially during Roman times. Not black at all. And to give you an idea, actually, of what Cleopatra probably looked like, I think we've got some pictures of some of these people, like Claudia Cardinal, for example. Claudia Cardinal is a famous actress from the 60s and 70s from Tunisia. Definitely not black. Also, if you want to have an idea what Cleopatra looked like, just look at the bust of Nefertiti. Nefertiti was an ancient Egyptian, and she very definitely was not black. And so her son was actually King Tut, and he wasn't black either. Actually, in Egypt at that time, black people were called Nubians. And in fact, they still are called Nubians. In fact, even in Cairo, in present day, there's an area in Cairo called the Nubian Quarter, which is sort of the black ghetto of Cairo, even today. And so, so even today they're referred to as Nubians. And all you have to do is just go to Luxor, and I think we have a picture of Luxor also, to see the difference between Nubians and Egyptians. So if you go to Luxor, some of the hieroglyphics and some of the depictions that are there that are very clear that the tour guide doesn't show you. You have to get off of the tour and wander around on your own and go look at these things. But if you do, and you know anything about looking at hieroglyphics at all, you can see very clearly that Egyptians and Nubians, and they are different, very different, depicted very differently, and Nubians are depicted as being black. And they're actually usually depicted as either being aggressive against them and then not being victorious, or they're being depicted as being slaves because they enslaved Nubians even in those days. And that's very clearly represented at Luxor. And then it brings us to also the same people that are promoting the narrative that actually she's black. I think they basically just want to claim that all of Egyptian history and all of the pharaohs and all of the history of Egypt, all the pharaohs were actually black, and all their achievements that they made were actually achievements of black people. And I think that's the narrative that they are trying to put out there. And it's very much like the false narrative, the intentional false narrative that China is trying to put out there about some of their history. To the point of where I've even heard people say that all of the Roman emperors were all black, because Septimus Severus was from Africa, and that he was black because he was from Africa. So all of the Roman emperors have to be black. Well, Septimus Severus was definitely not black either. Very much a white guy. Looked pretty much, the same way as Claudia Cardinal did. And we've got, I think, a picture of him too. I noticed they don't pick on popes. And the reason why is because we still have popes. And popes are clearly white. They've always been white. And throughout anybody's memory or historical knowledge, they've always been white. Yet, in Roman times, there were some popes that were from Africa, that were born in Africa. So they weren't black either. But they don't pick on popes. It's easier to pick on Roman emperors because we don't have Roman emperors anymore. So let's just hijack Roman emperors and claim that they were all black. Now, it's not that I'm not sympathetic toward the black cause in America and ending racism and things like that. Obviously, I am in favor of ending racism and all that. But by the same token, I do not like intentionally put out false narratives. I do not like that at all. Let's stick with the facts. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about Egypt, ancient Egypt, in Cleopatra's time. Actually, in Cleopatra's time, Egypt was actually ancient even in her day. The ancient Egyptians and all of the achievements of the pharaohs and things like that, and all of the great pyramids and stuff, were ancient history, were at least 1,000 years before even her time. And so even in her time, they were being covered over with sand and forgotten, and basically nobody really knew about it. And in fact, over time, they were pretty much forgotten to all history in the West, especially after the library, the very extensive library that was housed at Alexandria, Egypt, was burned to the ground by Mongol hordes, Mongolians in the 1200s. And has been no attempt or there was no attempt at trying to reconstruct that library. And so who knows, untold historical documentation that was lost in that event. But basically after that time, the wonders of the ancient Egyptians were basically lost to history, until they were finally discovered again, actually by Napoleon and his soldiers in the late 1700s, I think actually 1795. And the reason why Napoleon wanted to go into Egypt is basically because he was a bit of a student of history himself, and he wanted to, his dream, his desire was to sort of reunite and resurrect the Roman Empire, which is why he called himself emperor in 1800. Because his goal was to reunite the former Roman Empire, and of course Rome famously held Egypt at that time because of Cleopatra, and it's a famous actually a famous event was apparently one of Napoleon's soldiers actually shot the nose off of the Sphinx. It's a legend. But they also discovered the Rosetta Stone, which was a very important thing. And actually, then in the 1860s, archaeology just seemed to sort of explode. And part of that is because of Napoleon rediscovering the Egyptians, but also the reason why we had an archaeological boom, and actually all of the ologies. So not just archaeology, but also paleontology and anthropology, even geology. All of these things became a big deal, and poli-science and economics and all these things in the 1860s. In the 1860s, for whatever reason, we had an academic explosion in Western Europe. And I think part of that was not only the discovery again of the Egyptian Great Pyramids, but also the event of the steamship. And to give you an idea of the impact that the steamship had in the 1860s, is that steamships cut the time of travel. So especially after they built the Suez Canal, that was completed in 1869, and that actually sort of cuts through present-day Egypt into the Red Sea from the Mediterranean Sea. And so with steamships and after the completion of the Suez Canal, it made a trip from, let's say, England to India. Instead of it being a 6-month trip, it made it about a month or 5 weeks, maybe like 5 weeks. Quite a big difference from 6 months to 5 weeks. And so it went from a once-in-a-lifetime adventure to something you could do several times even within 1 year. So it really, really revolutionized travel, international travel, and that really is what stimulated, I think, the geology, the ologies, the archaeology, anthropology, paleontology to explode around that time. Now, the reason why Cleopatra specifically is so famous, and is actually the most famous of all of the Egyptian leaders, even more than Ramses II, is because of her connection to Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar is another false narrative that I would like to address. Julius Caesar was actually more like a Hitler, if you want a better comparison. But because Shakespeare kind of waxes poetically about him in the famous play that was done about him, Julius Caesar is depicted as being some great leader, some victorious, wonderful leader, a great noble person who tragically was betrayed by his subordinates and murdered on the Senate floor. And we have a very sympathetic feeling about Julius Caesar. But in fact, Julius Caesar ended the Roman Republic, which was a democracy. It wasn't the greatest democracy, it was sort of a representative democracy, but it was still nonetheless basically a democracy. And Julius Caesar ended that exactly the way Hitler ended it in Germany, and he became emperor, just like Hitler did. And he was basically getting too big for his britches. Now Caesar was, and so that's why the Senate, basically Brutus and Mark Antony and the other people in the Senate, felt like they had had enough, and that's why they murdered Julius Caesar. And actually he was only emperor for 1 year, 44 BC, before he was executed. Now imagine if somebody had done that with Hitler, how the world would have been different if we wouldn't have had World War II. Now Julius Caesar was a very effective general and was very successful in Gaul and in Iberia. Gaul now is France, Iberia present day is Spain. And he just ran roughshod over those places. And because he was such a successful general, is why he also tried to expand the empire, both eastward, beyond India, which is where Alexander the Great went to, and also south into Africa. And so, actually, Julius Caesar fought against the Nubians. And now, if you want a badass queen that really was black, if you want to make a movie about a badass queen that really actually was black, there was a Nubian queen called Amanirenas who defeated Julius Caesar in battle. And so here's a guy that just ran roughshod over Gaul and Iberia and all the rest of Europe, and he tries to extend Egypt south past the Nubians, so that's beyond Abu Simbel, which is Upper Egypt. If you look at a map, it seems like it's Lower Egypt, but it's Upper Egypt because the elevation is higher. But beyond that was basically present-day Sudan, what at the time was Nubians. And Nubians held that area all throughout Egyptian history and even into Roman times, and Amanirenas soundly defeated Julius Caesar. And in the battle, she lost an eye, and she was basically called the one-eyed warrior princess. But if you really want to make a movie about black glorious culture, and there's many people you can choose throughout history that you can be very proud of, but certainly this is one who is not talked about and is not known about and probably does deserve a movie, actually, and I would watch it. You know, it would be a very interesting movie. Okay, so once Julius Caesar destroyed the Roman Senate, and no longer did we have a, and the Roman Senate was like the American Senate, actually, or a parliament or something like that, and so the leaders of the Senate were kind of like prime ministers. But once that was eliminated by Julius Caesar, even though he was only the emperor for less than 1 year, we were never going to go back again. And so Julius Caesar was the first person to put himself on a coin. Before Julius Caesar, you saw busts on coins, but they were all like Hercules or some other kind of god. They were not actually a bust of themselves, although sometimes the image would look like the leader dressed as like a Roman or a Greek god or something. But basically the rule, as it is now in the United States, is if you're alive, you're not allowed to be on a coin. And so, but Julius Caesar ended that. He became emperor and he puts himself on a coin for the very first time. And once he had that kind of ultimate power, you know, there was no going back. And so when Octavius and Brutus and Mark Antony started to fight each other over who's going to succeed Julius Caesar, and they became the triumvirate. They all had their pictures on coins. And then Cleopatra, who no longer, of course, was associated with Julius Caesar because he was assassinated, now associated herself with Mark Antony. And so you've got Mark Antony on coins, and that's why we also have Cleopatra on coins. And if you look at Cleopatra's coin, you can clearly see that she was not black. And she also was probably no babe. Certainly not from her portrait on the coins, she wasn't a babe. She had a very, very distinctively large nose. Now, a lot of Greek women and like Middle Eastern or Indian women have, you know, very hawk-like big noses and can still be very beautiful. You know, I've seen some real beauties, you know, from that part of the world that had really big noses, but yet were very beautiful women. I mean, that could be the case. She may have just had a very big nose and was still beautiful. Hard to say. We don't have photographs. But if you look at her portrait on her coin, she was no babe, not on the coin. And it was not a very flattering picture of her. But that's why Cleopatra is more famous, and was more famous in the 17 and 1800s when academia was exploding, than even any of the actual Egyptian pharaohs, because we didn't actually even know who they were. We didn't know that Ramses II even existed or what his name was. We didn't know who built the pyramids until after we were able to interpret or decipher the Rosetta Stone, which was also about in the 1860s. And so, so eventually Brutus and then Mark Antony was defeated by Octavius. And so Octavius then became the new emperor of Rome, and he continued the tradition of the Caesars, and there's actually 12 Caesars, and he calls himself Augustus Caesar, actually after Julius Caesar, and he starts the tradition of all the Roman emperors are now called Caesar, and in fact that tradition extended all the way into the Imperium de Romanoi, or the Byzantine Empire, all the way until the end of that empire, which was 1453, and then even Ivan I, the first Romanov Tsar of Russia, supposedly, according to him, he claimed that he had married the granddaughter of the last emperor of the Byzantine Empire, but actually, which wasn't even called the Byzantine Empire in the 1500s when he made this claim. It was just called Rome. So he marries the last Caesar, he says, that the granddaughter of the last Caesar, and so, which that was Constantine the 11th, and he didn't actually have any children, but Ivan I said that he married his granddaughter, and so therefore he calls himself Tsar, C-Z-A-R, which means Caesar in Russian. And then he creates that whole dynasty of monarchs that ruled for 400 years in Russia. Okay, and so we've addressed all of these false narratives. We've addressed the false narrative of Cleopatra being black. And like I said, it's not that I'm against black people at all, but I'm against false narratives, especially that are being promoted by Jada Pinkett Smith, who I've actually met her, and she was a piece of work. Or BLM, which is not helping the cause at all. And so making intentional false narratives is not going to help. And it's going to annoy people like me that likes to bust false narratives. We've also busted the false narrative that Julius Caesar was this noble, great leader and this wonderful general, and the tragedy that he was assassinated on the Senate floor. It was actually a good thing that they assassinated him, because not only was he emperor, now he's on the coins. They just had enough. That was too much. But then that false narrative was actually put out by Shakespeare, who again is a hero of the West and a hero in Western media. And so that's the general false narrative that everybody thinks about Julius Caesar. And then the last one, that Queen Elizabeth I was the baddest ass queen who was the most determined to keep her rule, when actually that would have to go to Irene. And Irene was really a badass and really did extreme things to keep her power. And I will have a whole lesson on Irene in the future. And so in the meantime, I think that wraps it up for this particular lecture or episode. So please stay tuned, and we'll be back in hopefully less than a week. So I think that will be episode 5. So again, this was Learning with Power. I'm Scott Powers Houston. See you next time.